Now, we have not so much a speaker as a reader, because Tom Lewis, I don't know where he is, but he's not here. He's done the chapter in the book on the war at sea. But Andrew is going to read, I hope, as an extract of the chapter, in order to give you a flavour and ensure that the Navy is not left out, because they do tend to complain that they get left out, don't they, Jan? Yes. Yes. So, Andrew,
thank you.
Come pretend to be Tom Lewis for 15 minutes.
Well, Tom Lewis is on at sea.
Oh, he doesn't look like anything like Tom Lewis.
Actually, I should also extend the apologies of Professor Carmen McLean, who's teaching at the University of Heidelberg in Germany and couldn't be bothered. No, couldn't justify coming in here for a 15-minute talk. That's all right. And Tom has got some other commitments, unfortunately. We didn't get to him early enough about the conference. I was pleased to see some of the images put up there of the art, particularly, destroyers like Napier and so on, because the Australian destroyers were really the stars of the RAN in the Burma campaign, and it's broken down basically into four things. The battles off Ceylon with the Japanese naval attack on Ceylon in April 42, and the sinking of the HMS Vampire, which is up top left, and HMS Hermes, the aircraft carrier on the bottom right, by the Japanese naval aircraft like the Cape dive bomber you see they're taking off. Thanks to Peter Green for finding that photograph. And on the left bottom corner, just to get this out of the way, is the Canadian Catalina that spotted the Japanese fleet in the distance and managed to give some warning to Ceylon that this was coming. Unfortunately, the Zeros quickly, the naval Zeros, quickly shot him down, and they all spent the rest of the war as prisoners, but they did a remarkable thing to find those, the Japanese fleet 160 miles off Ceylon. I've got to keep using this, don't I? I keep forgetting. So, as described by Tom in the book, the RAN had been very busy in the war. Most of the RAN assets had gone to the Mediterranean to help the Royal Navy with its fight against Italy and then Germany. It wasn't until later that they started coming back to Australia to join in with the Southwest Pacific area. But we had a number of losses. We had Sydney, of course, went under in November 41 off the coast of Western Australia. Then we had Canberra in the Battle of Save Australia in the Solomons. We lost some ships here, there, and everywhere, really. One off Timor, Armidale. We had, and then finally, and among all of this, Vampire, which had been working, it was an old ship, had been launched in 1917. So it really was obsolete, actually, in many ways. But it had heavy service in the Mediterranean, had been bombed by the Italians, been bombed by the Stukas and so on, taken people out of Tabuk. Finally it was deployed back to Singapore and was deployed up to attack Japanese transports coming into Malaya, and the sister destroyer from the Royal Navy was sunk. So it had been around the traps a bit, and the crew was pretty experienced. And then it was sent over to Ceylon. Now, in Ceylon, we had Colombo down on the southwest corner, and we had how did you say that, Bill? Trigonometry?
No.
Trincomalee.
Trincomalee.
Okay. Trincomalee was the RN naval base up close to India on the northeast side of Ceylon. At the time that as part of the Far Eastern Fleet. Now, of course, when the Japanese had taken Singapore and Malaya and so on, suddenly Ceylon became very vulnerable. It was well defended in terms of, it had enough anti-aircraft guns and so on, but the Far Eastern Fleet was in a very precarious position. So Admiral Somerville, who was the admiral in charge of their fleet at that time, took his fleet away from Ceylon, hoping to run into the Japanese fleet, by the way, that they knew was coming in general terms, but didn't have any luck. The big battleships they had started running out of water, so they headed off to Mauritius. It's a miles off Mauritius where they had a base. Meanwhile, a Vampire, who was escorting the small and also equally old a British small carrier, 10,000 tonnes carrier. It only carried 20 aircraft. It had no aircraft on it because the aircraft had been flown off to the land, onto land bases in Ceylon. And it had also been launched in very early years. I think it was launched in 1919, but not commissioned until 1924. And it had a complement of about 566 men. It's a hell of a lot of men for a small ship, but that's how it was in those days. They were sent up to Trincomalee, to the northern base. There were 2 British cruisers in Colombo. They both got sunk by the Japanese when 85 aircraft dive bombers and about 9 Zeros a company took off to do these attacks. They attacked Colombo, sank these 2 cruisers, and Vampire and Hermes were told to shoot down south because from that place and get around to join the rest of the fleet. But the Japanese caught them on their route south around to Colombo and attacked them. Something like, I think there was something like 15 aircraft attacked the Vampire. They sank the Hermes in about 10 minutes. And it went down. It lost something like 307 of its complement of 566. The rest are in the water. And then little Vampire, doing its best, but had basically 15 dive bombers attacking it at one stage. Quickly also got sunk. See, I'm not a Navy person, am I? And fortunately, given the ferocity and the violence of the attack, it was quite lucky that not more were killed. But the commander, Thomas Moran, no relative, right? And 8 natives went down with the ship. The remainder in the water. Fortunately for them, there was a hospital ship, a British hospital ship called the Vita, which was in that general area, and that came in and picked up about 600 people out of the water, including the Vampire people, and took them into Colombo, where our VADs and Red Cross people met them. So that was the end of that. And the Hermes has been found, but Vampire's never been found despite 2 expeditions to try and find it. They believe it's 5,000 feet down at the bottom of the sea. The second area of the RAN's involvement in the theatre with convoy protection / anti-submarine patrol, but those 2 were combined really. Of course, the Japanese had submarines active in the Indian Ocean, right up to Aden, down towards South Africa. And later in the war, the Germans joined in and had a couple of submarines there as well, operating out of Penang in Malaya. The convoys that went from India with absolutely critical war supplies like rubber and oil and things like that would go from, collect from Calcutta, come around to Bombay, collect, go up to Karachi, pick some more up, go on across to East Africa, then down to South Africa, and then the long haul up to England on the other side, where the Germans were waiting, and on this side the Japanese were waiting. So there was a very heavy transport merchantman losses during that time. For example, the British India Steam Navigation Company had 123 vessels at the start of the war, but by 1945 they'd lost 51. The Clan Line, which actually evacuated, one of their ships evacuated a lot of the RAF guys and RAF guys from Rangoon in 42, they lost 37 of their 55 ships. And a lot of the stevedores, the Lascars, as they were called at the time, came from India. And very little work's been done on their sacrifice and their contribution to that. But these small ships, the corvettes and the destroyers in particular, were fitted with radar. Unfortunately, the merchantmen had no radar, so the enemy submarines would often come up on the surface to destroy them, not from underwater as we've seen in Dasput and so on. But at least the escorts had radar and ASDIC, so they could actually ping them occasionally, and they did occasionally sink the Japanese sub a couple of times. But on the other side, the Germans really got into it because they knew those convoys were coming up. So there was a huge amount of convoy activity going on, and these small small boats, the destroyers and corvettes in particular, were very suited for being sort of sheepdogs around convoys and whizzing around and just keeping alert to submarines when they could. Of course, one of the big news stories of shipping losses was the Ismail Khedive in 1944 that was torpedoed in the Indian Ocean off East Africa, coming up towards Aden, which was carrying about, I think from memory, something like 1,700 troops or something on board, and they lost like 1,200 of them on board. Shot by a torpedo. Torpedoed by a U-boat, that's better. The third area of fleet ops was, as the war wore on, the Eastern Fleet, the British Eastern Fleet, became the British Pacific Fleet, gradually rebuilt its resources, particularly after Normandy. And the U-boat threat was gradually pushed back in the late 44 and in 45. So you suddenly had, three fast carriers, you had battleships, you had so on, and you had the US Navy joining in with the aircraft carrier USN Saratoga, and the Far Eastern Fleet then, with Fleet Air Arm chaps on board with their aircraft, did a couple of raids on Sumatra and Japanese ports and facilities in that area, particularly the port of Sabang, and Australian destroyers were part of that enterprise. Quiberon, Napier, Nepal, and Nizam, and Napier was shown earlier, were all destroyers in that, busy picking up drowning pilots who'd fallen off the end of their carriers with their planes, and so on. The fourth area was the shore gunnery support in the littoral region of the Arakan, because as the ground forces of the Allies, and particularly the British, came down through the Arakan region, that is the coastal region of Burma, it needed, it for the first time was able to get naval gunfire support. And the Australian destroyers were busy, and the corvettes like Toowoomba, but as usual, Napier and Nepal and some of the others that you've heard of already were busy along in late 44 and into 45 doing ship-to-shore gunfire support for the troops, but also, more important in some respects, carrying on their decks parties of troops to come down and land them in small boats in different islands in the invasion path. There was, in fact, there's an island called Ramri Island, which is south of, you'd have to know your map, it's hard, but it's a decent island about halfway down the coast of Rangoon. And the first person ashore to put a flag up, an Australian flag, was the commander of the Norman, or one of the other destroyers, Nizam maybe. So they were pretty active there. Now, the British Pacific Fleet, which then was formed towards the end of 45, which had 95 ships, there were 18 RAN ships in that fleet. So, you can see that the Navy was involved in widespread operations, but not with capital ships, but just like the Air Force air crews. They were providing the sort of essential support to allow the British Navy to do other things and to make up for losses that they'd already had as well. Now, Darryl, you can probably answer me this question. How many Burma Stars were awarded to the Navy?
A little over 5,000 to Australia.
To the Navy, how many?
About 2/3 of that number.
Yeah, so the Navy got 2/3 of the Burma Stars. The Air Force only got 1,100.
About 1,200.
1,200.
1,300.
But unlike the Navy chaps, the Air Force chaps, if they went on from Burma to then go on to Bougainville or Southwest Pacific anyway, they would be awarded a Pacific Star with a Burma class, which sort of accounts for in some respects, the difference in the numbers of Burma Stars awarded. The Navy guys who were in port for a few days, off for a few days, came back for a few days, they got, every one of them got a Burma Star. So that was, we couldn't work that out at the beginning, could we? How come the Navy got so many? But when you think about the numbers on ships, it makes sense after a while.
Andrew, I can tell you why. It's because it's for a tour of duty. And if you're in the same ship running backwards and forwards, whether it be the Mediterranean, if it has to be for a period of at least 6 months in the Mediterranean, and there are 2 actual stars depending on what period, and the Burma star I would suspect would be similar, that the Navy therefore was, because it was supplying and taking troops and everything, they would actually be in that theatre of war for potentially longer than, say, the Air Force would be flown in and flown back in
Yeah,
a shorter
I
period.
take
Does that
that,
make sense? But it's worth knowing, because then that explains why.
I'm not complaining, I was just...
No, no. But,
I was trying to
maybe
mansplain.
Maybe people don't understand that, you see. I mean, the honours, the actual
Yeah, well,
bravery awards
that's
are
right.
different.
We had Air Force crews coming to Burma, which had been had an Atlantic star and an African star as well, and then get a Burma star or a Pacific.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's really the story of the Navy, and Tom, of course, being a naval expert and author of several fine books. Again, you have to buy the book to read. So I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew, aka Tom, mounting the longest advert I've seen in many a long day.